公演ゲディスのサークルにおけるオシアン音響性ケルトの黄昏。 Professor from Dundee University, Norman Shaw, Ocean's Sonality and the Celtic Twilight in Geddes Circle.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me say it's an immense pleasure to be invited here to Yamaguchi. The title of my paper is Ocean Sonority and the Celtic Twilight in Geddes' Circle. And in this paper I shall be looking in particular at works by two key members of Geddes' Circle, namely the painter John Duncan and the writer William Sharp, also known as Fiona MacLeod. The movement that these artists represent, gathered around Geddes, is often referred to as the Celtic Twilight. Their aesthetics depend largely on ancient Gaelic tales and myths, and their revival and reappropriation was a fundamental preoccupation for Geddes and the artists associated with him. In particular, the myths of Ossian, to which I shall now turn. Incidentally, the first image here, not listed, is a depiction of Ossian's Hall in Pennycook, which is sadly now has burned down. This is a watercolour. The decorations on it by Alexander Runciman, who I'll be talking about. So, on to Macpherson's Ossian. James Macpherson's The Works of Ossian was originally published in 1765 and then republished in 1896 by Geddes on the centenary of Macpherson's death. Macpherson's Ossian claimed to be a retelling of mythical events from Scotland's pre-Christian, prehistoric past, as told by the blind bard Ossian, featuring Fingal, Cuchulainn, Oscar, and other mythical figures from Celtic prehistory. The tales, Macpherson claimed, were gleaned from journeys to Ireland and the northwest Highlands of Scotland. The Ossianic tales were hailed by Europeans as a Celtic equivalent of the Homeric myths, and thus became extremely popular in the late 18th and 19th centuries, read by Napoleon and depicted by painters such as Girodet, Runge and Ingres. Ossian was also enthusiastically appropriated by Blake for the epic style of his great mythic cycles, as well as his representation of the idea of the North as a place of unnamed forms and spiritual purity. At the time of its publication, the mythical landscape of Ossian was projected onto a Scottish Highland landscape that was still suffering the aftershocks of the clearances, which had happened only 2 decades previously, a depopulated landscape that craved a new mythopoeic identity. Disregarding debates about its authenticity, Macpherson's Ossian owes its popularity to a fusion of the new aesthetic of the sublime with contemporaneous notions of myth and geography. Ossian is crucially placed in a sonic world. Many of the descriptions in the text rely on sonic dynamics and metaphors. And I quote from Macpherson's Ossian: "Beside a stream of roaring foam, his cave is in a rock. One tree bends above it, and the rushing winds echo against its sides." Macpherson strives to reproduce what I will call a sonorous landscape, which runs parallel to the narrative, maintaining a vagueness that permeates the text. The sonorous, I suggest, is a device that references the sonic, yet which strives to realise what is beyond the audible or visible. Ossian is written in a repetitive, chant-like manner, constructing a convoluted wall of words, like the mountainous landscape it strives to depict, designed to be read aloud in keeping with the ancient oral tradition from which it is derived. It is a relentless torrent of repetitious subplots and micro-narratives. Its protagonists are trans-historical emanations from the corporeal landscape, underground interdimensional heroes. In this way, the structure of Ossian can be read as rhizomatic in the Deleuzian sense. A rhizome is an organism that thrives underground as a root system, like bulbs or mushrooms, appearing at arbitrary points in the surface. Deleuze favoured the rhizome in opposition to the tree, a rhizome thought instead of an arboreal thought. If we take the tree to be a symbol of Enlightenment thought forms, then the rhizome is a fitting analogue for Ossian's post-Enlightenment, proto-romantic structure. Macpherson uncovers new connections, linking, for instance, the underground systems of an ancient oral tradition with contemporary notions of the sublime landscape above the ground. Rhizomatics also relates strongly to my concept of the sonorous as a disruptive force, confounding linearity. Deleuze and Guattari apply their concept to music, claiming that musical form, right down to its ruptures and proliferations, is comparable to a weed, a rhizome. Gaston Bachelard understands this appeal to landscape mnemonics and mythopoeia through the sonorous, and not necessarily in the strictly sonic meaning of the word. This employment of the sonorous, as we shall see later, also echoes Geddes' idea of synergy as a harmonious whole. Bachelard invokes Minkowski, who writes, "For my part, I believe that this is precisely where we should see the world come alive, and, independent of any instrument, of any physical properties, fill up with penetrating deep waves which, although not sonorous in the sensory meaning of the word, are not for this reason less harmonious, resonant, melodic, and capable of determining the whole totality of life." As a presentation of the unpresentable, the sonorous also relies on a kind of obscurity, an echo of absence, an emphasis on the spectral and the ghostly. Often criticised by modernists for this twilit vagueness, the Ossianic Highlands actually benefit from this obscurity. In his key 18th century work on the sublime, Edmund Burke classed obscurity as an important aid to evoking the sublime and the infinite, together with vacuity, darkness, solitude and silence. Crucially for Macpherson, obscurity and the emphasis on darkness awakens Burke to prehistory and paganism, unknown origins, and as Burke states, some sort of approach towards infinity which nothing can do whilst we are able to perceive its bounds. Alexander Runciman's drawing of Ossian singing from 1770 depicts the bard sitting under a windswept tree. The belief that Ossian was blind, reciting his poetry against the music from his clarsach, or Celtic harp, highlights this foregrounding of sound elements over the other senses. The image demonstrates the importance of sonic phenomena as an integrating force, seeing humanity and nature contained within the same whirling mass. The oral nature of the Gallic Ossianic tradition means that every retelling reappropriates the sonic template, thus being both trans-temporal and spatial. The Scottish Highlands were now regarded as a visualisation of the sublime, thanks to Macpherson's Ossian. Human mythopoeic narrative was implicated in the shapes of mountains and forests in elemental experience. Ossian also set up discords within the Highland landscape by allowing narrative to dissolve into a sonorous space, revealing new borders between the real, i.e. named and imagined landscape. Runciman's Fingal and Comban Cargla from 1772 consequently shows the figures continuous with the trees, rocks and clouds. Sonic phenomena can function as metaphysical apparatus, as a means of realising absence. In an essay entitled Acoustic Space, Humphrey Carpenter and Marshall McLuhan stress the magical importance of acoustic phenomena, appealing to the prehistoric oral culture to which Ossian belongs, and which Macpherson's Ossian evokes, highlighting its magical power to make present the absent thing. And I quote, "Poets have long used the word as incantation, evoking the visual image by magical acoustic stress. Preliterate man was conscious of this power of the auditory to make present the absent thing. Writing annulled this magic because it was a rival magical means of making present the absent sound. The sonorous aspects of Ossian, although written, serve to materialise an entropic, absent, and necessarily vague landscape through dissonant droning and vague reverberations." who now go on to John Duncan and William Sharp. Geddes had formed the Patrick Geddes Colleagues and Company in 1895, commencing with the publication of the Evergreen periodical. He used the painter John Duncan as the chief illustrative artist, and the writer William Sharp as managing director and a major contributor to the text. It was this group who republished Macpherson's Ossian, reintroducing it to a new audience within a new synergistic framework. However, Sharp left the company after 2 years due to the international success of works by his alter ego Fiona MacLeod. Sharp wrote that this new Scoto-Celtic movement was fundamentally the outcome of Ossian. He wrote the introduction to Geddes' new edition. In his concern with origins, Geddes drew on the Ossianic aesthetic, hijacking vital yet misappropriated ideas and reapplying them, claiming that these things are not ancient and dead, but modern and increasing. That the Ossianic aesthetic has also been appropriated by J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and numerous other fantasy authors, not to mention current trends in Celtic shamanism and folk movements, reinforces this view of these things being modern and increasing. As we shall see, both William Sharp, as Fiona MacLeod, and John Duncan continued to exploit the Ossianic as a source for their material. They explore the same post-Ossianic world in parallel and can be usefully examined together. John Duncan's St. Bride, from 1913, illustrates the interdimensional nature of these artists' vision, where the landscape is impregnated with decorative Celtic motifs, whose flatness literally induces a new plane in the painting. This harmonious synthesis of heterogeneous modes of representation through a kind of collaging can be seen as a visualization of Geddes' idea of synergy as a parallelism of different disciplines. Duncan applies this collage aesthetic to a native tradition, which is becoming fragmented and multi-layered as antiquarianism and archaeology gain ground. Bride, or Bridget, as both pagan goddess and Christian saint, personifies the mingling or continuance of Celtic pre-Christian ideas with Christian belief. Fiona MacLeod's St. Bridget of the Shores was published in the 1896 edition of The Hills of Dream, providing a textual background for the interplay of styles and symbolism evident in Duncan's painting of 1913. MacLeod also told one version of the Bride story in the autumn edition of the Evergreen. St. Bride is the supposed foster mother of Christ, transported by angels to Bethlehem on the eve of his birth. But the legend of St. Bride, MacLeod claims, goes further back than the days of the monkish chroniclers who first attempted to put the disguise of verbal Christian raiment on the most widely loved and revered beings of the ancient Gallic pantheon. Long before the maiden Brigida made her fame as a daughter of God, the Gaels worshipped a Brige, or bride, goddess of women, of fire, of poetry, one whom the Druids held in honour as a torchbearer of the eternal light, a daughter of the morning. Robert Graves connects Bride with the triple goddess, the earth goddess herself, while Sir James Fraser called St. Bridget an old heathen goddess of fertility, disguised in a threadbare Christian cloak. The pan-cultural vision of John Duncan, then, finds grounding in the emerging global mysticism realised by Fiona MacLeod through delicate distinctions between history and myth. Geddes also happily flits between history and myth as mutually informative narratives. In the murals for Ramsay Gardens in Edinburgh that Geddes commissioned to John Duncan, Geddes stresses a parallelism between Scotland's scientific tradition and its mythic tradition by having Duncan represent the awakening of Cuchulainn, or the taking of Excalibur, which we see here, within the same narrative as, for instance, the calling of St. Mungo, or Michael Scott, medieval translator of Aristotle and inquirer into scientific matters. Duncan frequently paints in tempera, including in large-scale work like The Riders of the She from 1911 and St. Bride from 1913. And this is The Riders of the She. The flatness of this media allows Duncan a more decorative aesthetic, where spatial representation is necessarily ambiguous. In a similar way to Ossian, his figures become landscape elements, pre-Christian and Christian personifications of the mythopoeic landscape. The central female figure in Duncan's Anima Celtica image, published in the Evergreen in 1895, has been identified by Murdo MacDonald as Bride also, and Murdo actually showed that image in his lecture. This time surrounded by Ossianic figures such as Cuchulainn, Finn, and Ossian himself. The flatness and quasi-collage nature of many of Duncan's designs, together with their trans-historical subject matter, indicate the layered, non-linear worlds they represent, where the Gedesian in-world collides with the out-world. John Duncan's The Riders of the Sidhe from 1911, which we see here, depicts the Sidhe, or the Celtic fairies, a divine race who inhabit the other world of the dead, perceived only in visionary states of mind, and usually at liminal places such as stone circles, sacred groves, wells, and fairy hills or fairy glens. In the introduction to her drama The Immortal Hour, Fiona MacLeod emphasises that the Sidhe, or hidden people, were great and potent, not small and insignificant beings, as Duncan's portrayal of them reinforces. MacLeod's retelling of the ancient poem The March of the Fairy Host, which she includes in her anthology of Celtic poetry, Lyra Celtica, almost reads as a description of Duncan's painting. Sons of kings and queens are one and all. On all their heads are beautiful golden yellow manes, with smooth comely bodies, with bright blue-starred eyes, with pure crystal teeth, with thin red lips. The Sidhe are setting out on the eve of Beltane, bearing symbols as follows: the tree of life and knowledge, the cup of the heart of abundance and healing, the sword of the will on the active side, and the crystal of the will on its passive side. Symbols which Lindsay Errington perceives as betraying in their type of symbolism the still lingering influence of Patrick Geddes. Experiences of the Sidhe are usually accompanied by sonorous phenomena. Duncan claimed to have heard fairy music whilst painting, and seems naturally inclined towards trance-like states, as John Kempley writes in his book on Duncan. And he writes, "He saw with the inner eye of his imagination forms more beautiful than any he had ever seen with the outer eye. But these were not forms alone, they were living people with quick eyes and strange solemn gestures, who move as if in some ritual." This absorption into the in-world, however, would be interrupted by the responsibilities of the outworld, as Duncan writes from the Hebridean Isle of Barra. "I have 2 young people with me who won't let me lapse into the long trance that otherwise would completely absorb me. Perhaps it is best so. This Celtic glamour and twilight is a dangerous dope." Fiona MacLeod typically refers to the sonorous aspect of this state of altered consciousness. "I have heard, I have dreamed, I too have heard, have sung that song, O lordly ones that dwell in secret places in the hollow hills." W.Y. Evans Vence's The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries was first published the same year as Duncan painted The Riders of the Sidhe. This classic study of the reality of fairy sightings reflects an interest in the mythopoeic landscape, an aspect of the living folk tradition from which Ossian was drawn. The majority of its numerous accounts of encounters with fairies feature particular sounds or music in their description. Evans Vence's book is also comparable to Macpherson's Ossian in that its contents were drawn from actual accounts taken on trips to the Celtic northwestern shores of Europe, and finds mythical creatures implicit in the corporeal landscape. Geddes's in-world manifest in the outworld. A later painting of Bride by Duncan, The Coming of Bride, from 1918, portrays her in her guise as pagan goddess of the earth. MacLeod also links Bride with sonic phenomena. They refer to one whom the bards and singers revered as mistress of their craft, she whose breath was a flame, and that flame's song, whom every poet, from the humblest wandering singer to Ossian of the songs, from Ossian of the songs to Angus Og on the rainbow, or to meteor of the underworld, blessed because of the flame she put in the heart of poets, as well as the red life she put in the flame that springs from wood and peat. Bride is thus mistress of the sonorous. MacLeod links oral experience with the metaphysical through its personification in Bride. The importance of sound and music within Geddes' revivalist programme is demonstrated by him commissioning Duncan to paint a series of murals on the history of pipe music, and the presence of Pan in the design betrays its links to the pagan past. MacLeod's By the Yellow Moon Rock employs a fey piper in its evocation of megalithic mnemonics. Interestingly, the piper appears on the Day of Bride. Geddes uses sonic metaphors such as harmony and discord to describe his idea of revival through synergy, and I quote, "The sorely needed knowledge, both of the natural and the social order, is approaching maturity. The long-delayed renaissance of art has begun, and the prolonged discord of these is changing into harmony. So with these for guidance, men shall no longer grind on in slavery to a false image of their lower selves, miscalled self-interest, but at length, as free men, live in sympathy and labour in the synergy of the race." In Fares, MacLeod demonstrates the folk song's sonic evocation of primeval highland landscape and collective pre-literate memory, summoning the infant Ossian as a gauge. The song was old, older than the oldest things, save the summits of the mountains, the granite isles and the brooding pain of the sea. Long ago it had been sung by wild Celtic voices, before ever spoken word was writ in letters. Before that again, mayhap, and caught perhaps from a wailing Pictish mother. So ancient was the moving old world strain, so antique the words of the lullaby, that was dim with age when it soothed to sleep the child Ossian, son of Fingal. An early poem by MacLeod indicates the centrality of sonorous themes to her work, where landscape sonics parallel the sonics of the soul. This echoes Geddes' synergistic approach of harmony and discord as environmental and social registers, and anticipates the work of acoustic ecologists like L. Murray Schafer, who claims that every place has a keynote sound that reflects the sonic health of that place. Fiona MacLeod writes, "There is in everything an undertone. Those clear in soul are also clear in sight, and recognise in a white cascade's flash the roar of mountain torrents and the wail of multitudinous waves on barren sands, as something deeper than mere audible and visible sensations. We all are wind harps, casemented on earth, and every breath of God that falls may fetch some dimmest echo of a faint refrain from even the worst strung of all of us." W.B. Yeats described his acquaintance William Sharp as one through whom the fluidic world seemed to flow, disturbing all. Sharp, through his pseudonym Fiona MacLeod, appropriates the sonorous aspects of Macpherson's Ossian in his fictional works such as Fares, The Mountain Lovers, The Dominion of Dreams, and Where the Forest Murmurs, to create a kind of hallucinatory neo-Celtic dream world set in the Northwest Highlands. Typically, MacLeod uses sonics to represent spaces of loss and an absent absolute, and in many ways, MacLeod's sonorous aesthetic has strong resonances with Lyotard's notion of negative presentation, and I quote, "The absolute is never there, never given in a presentation, but it is always present as a call to think beyond the there. Ungraspable but unforgettable, never restored, never abandoned. This mode of presence of the absolute is the grounds for the negative presentation." This further echoes Carpenter and McLuhan's idea of making present the absent thing. Sharp's biographer Flavia Alaya reinforces this idea, referring to his use of chant-like repetition. The use of chant is itself intimately connected with the pervasive tendency of the Celts, as Sharp often described them, to see the thing beyond the thing, to view surface phenomena as signs and symbols, a tendency which was quite legitimately extended to language. Geddes refers to this world beyond appearances, which has never been seen with bodily eye, as the in-world, in his essay The World Without and the World Within from 1905. A concluding quote from this essay by Geddes not only anticipates quantum theory by suggesting that mind and matter are one, but also implicitly invokes our blind bard Ossian, who saw without his bodily eye into the fragmentary, sonorous world of the imagination, for which John Duncan and Fiona MacLeod's Ossianic Otherworld is at least an analogue. Next, the in-world. This has never been seen with bodily eye, yet is no imaginary world for all that. In a very true and thorough sense, it is more familiar, more real than the other. For all we know, or can ever know of the outworld, or of each other, is in our minds. I think, therefore I am, said a great philosopher long ago, while another is famous for having puzzled people by seeming to deny that there was any matter at all. But when you think a little, you see something of what he meant, that all we know of matter is in mind. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。それでは続きまして質疑応答に移らせていただきます。Thank you very much. We go into discussion Q&A. ご質問等ある方いらっしゃいますか？
Thanks, Norman. There was one thing I was really fascinated, well, a number of things I was really fascinated about in your lecture. But at the back of my mind, or a recurring factor in my mind, was what now? Where would you see the context of activity, particularly with your idea of negative presentation? Where would you see the artist working in this vein, this area? Now, how would you see the form of their work, if that was a predictable form to see?
Do you mean the vision? Sorry.
Do you want me to repeat it?
No.
No. Too fast. Okay, I'll say it again. In the context of the contemporary scene, how would you see, particularly given your comments about negative presentation, the work of artists today working in this area?
Negative presentation.今日のお話の中でそのネガティブプレゼンテーションというのが出てきましたけれども、それを、その今のその現代芸術の作品で具体的に見ていくとどうなりますかっていうことかと思うんですが。
Well, I think as I was explaining, in a sense, this can best be negatively presented through sound. As Marshall McLuhan said, that sonic form has always been used to make present the absent thing. In another sense, it involves a kind of sidelong glance, a sort of peripheral vision, in a way. It also relates, I think, to discussions we've had about the void, about nothingness. Beyond that, do you mean in visual art specifically?
I mean, I would extend it to all. I mean, I would extend that to anyone, but what I made allusion in my lecture to the writings of Kuno Meyer, the German scholar, and I can't remember the exact quotation, but he refers to not just the surface similarity of Japanese haiku and early Celtic nature verse, which they're almost inexchangeable.
Mm.
とにかくなんかネガティブプレゼンテーションっていうのはポジティブなプレゼンテーションじゃなくて何か今日のアランさんのお話にも出てきたみたいなネガティブ否定的なっていう言葉を使うときはこう無なんかが関係してくるわけですね。否定神学とかそういう場合もそうですしないものとの関係でこう、表現しようとするっていうかちょっと今うまく言えないんですが全くちょっと集中力を私を失ってしまったので申し訳ないんですがそれを現代の特にビジュアルアートというものに限らず、いろんな芸術との関係で、どういうふうに見ていますかっていうようなことをおっしゃったと思うんですがちょっと私は答えが今全く分からなかった状態ですいません。
Yeah, Norman, I was very interested in what you're saying. I was just wondering whether you... is this on?
Yeah.
Is this on? Okay, yeah. I was just wondering whether, just picking up on Alan's point about negative presentation, whether you felt that your own work, which you haven't shown here, but which obviously draws out of the landscape sonorous qualities, but in a very, very abstracted way, whether you'd feel that that was a kind of negative presentation, and whether you might feel that perhaps some of the things that Alan has perhaps done with his cube work with Shinichi Ogawa might be seen in negative presentational terms also.
Yeah, I think in both senses we're talking about a kind of reductionism, but in different ways. With my own work, the reductionism is really in terms of a visual metaphor, and also a kind of hijacking almost of quite cliched representations of Highland landscape. But also my work recently on this kind of a theme has been purely a black line on white paper for several years now, and this in itself, for me, was a form of a negative presentation. It's also, in a sense, a mode of drawing which I try to allow to hover between being, in a sense, a sonic metaphor, but also using the landscape itself as a kind of land wave, basically. I also cannot really see my drawings in isolation. They must, in a sense, be seen alongside the sound work I do, which in similar ways, in a sense, hijacks cliched representations of the Highlands through bagpipe music, etc., and then either reduces it to a very simple sound, or I collage a vast range of different musical sources together, so that it almost, in a sense, bamboozles the listener. But in terms of Alan's work, I think the theme negative presentation could be a very useful one. I think the way in which Alan's work is a negative presentation is reasonably obvious. I don't know what you would say about that, Alan.
まあでもなんかアランの作品、小川真一さんたちの作品との関係の話になってるんですが、その辺の
My observations, what you said, as you were talking, I kept on thinking about Agnes Martin, and there's no artist who I know who plays or works around this idea of negative presentation. But it was also the musical analogy, just an amusing conversation with Agnes Martin when John Cage was mentioned. She hates John Cage and loves Beethoven.
ネガティブプレゼンテーションというのは否定的な提示ということで、提示しないことによって提示するっていうことなんですね。でそれを先ほどからアランさんは俳句、日本の俳句と、俳句は短い詩の中で、豊かな広がりを示すということなんで、ネガティブプレゼンテーションの例でしょうと。あとケルティック、スコットランドの方ではナチュラルバースって言ってましたけど、自然史みたいなものがおそらくあって、そこは僕はよく知りませんけども、それも似たような例ではないだろうかと。で先ほど発表者の方に質問したのは、視覚芸術に限らずに、そういった例があるかということをおっしゃっていたんですが、でアランがまた今ついさっきコメントしたのはアグネス・マーチンという抽象画家なんですけども、非常にシンプルな絵を描く人がいます。で、その画家と音楽家ではジョン・ケージを挙げられて、ジョン・ケージは4分33秒という、講演者が、演奏者がですね壇上に現れて、ピアノの、蓋を開けて、で閉めるまでの4分33秒間は何も演奏しないで会場の音を聞くという、つまりピアノは演奏しないんだけども、その演奏しないことによって、何かを感じ取ろうというような、そういうネガティブプレゼンテーションの恒例があるんですけども、そういった音楽家と、ビジュアル画家の、対話っていうことを考えた時に、アグネス・マーチンは、ジョン・ケージが嫌いで、その代わりにベートーベンが好きなんだっていうことをちょっと冗談めかしておっしゃったと、そんな流れです。
Can I also add something about the negative presentation of the use of sound? It's only recently through digital technology with sound where that we've been able to generate frequencies that are way, way above and way below our audible range. And it's interesting that recent findings in acoustic archaeology have also discovered particular sound frequencies being present in prehistoric sites. And in a sense, this is a type of negative presentation in that the sounds resonate, the waveforms resonate in the body and actually engender particular psychological effects. This is very similar to, say, in a nightclub playing loud techno music or whatever, which also has a direct physical effect, sort of beyond the hearing. It's actually acting specifically on the body. So there's a big arch there from modern technology and what's happened in the past.
それと今翔さんが付け加えられたのは、最近のテクノロジーの発達によって、我々が普通に音楽とかいう形で認識する、レンジ幅以外の音域のものですね、超高音とか超低音とかいうようなものも、作品として取り入れられるようになってきている傾向があると。これ現代美術の傾向なんですけども、つまり身体に直接、衝撃として働きかける、超、重低音とかですね、そういったものを活用するようになってきていると。でそれが実は最近の現代的なテクノロジーの、成果のように思われるけれども、先史時代ですね、我々が言葉を持つ前とかいうようなレベルでの古い時代にコミュニケーションとして存在していたものとのリンク、橋渡しのようなものになっているんじゃなかろうかということを示唆されました。
Just about the technology. I mean, what is very interesting, and we have someone here, I hope he's here, Masayuki Yoshinoharu, who is very interested in early Soviet technology. And a lot of that technology was predicated on the idea that you could measure the unmeasurable. You know, like psychic research was measurable. So it's very interesting to go through this loop again, you know, to make the Hofstadter analogy, that we're kind of making a loop as we go through prehistory, history, and back. But it's very, very interesting about this, how it was attempted to measure the, what you might call it, the psychic. And this was being done within the context of a materialist philosophy.
Okay. 多分これはアランさん自身が発表された時に身体っていうことをおっしゃってたことと関わるんだと思いますけども、例として安原先生が、ロシアのですね近代頃の、テクノロジーが発達するぐらいの頃の、思想で、アンメジャブルって言ってましたけども、測定できないものということに注目していたというようなことだったと思いますが、でそういったものがそのテクノロジーということに関して言えば、テクノロジーとテクノロジー以前というところでまたループしているんだと、そのループにおいて身体フィジカルなものがキーワードになっているということをまたコメントされました。
Also, when we're considering early technology and early Russian technology, the gentleman you mentioned will probably know more about this than me, but basically the first ever synthesizer operated through visual means. It was called the ANS, named after the composer Alexander Scriabin, and basically the composer or player would draw onto a plate. It was covered with thick ink, thick viscous ink, and the drawing would be read by a system of 800 different light beams or light sources, which transferred the sounds into transferred the image into sound via 800 oscillators, and this is basically the first ever synthesizer.
細かいことはちょっと記憶に残しきれないんですが、アレクサンダーさんかな、アレクサンダースクリアベン、という作曲家の方がいらっしゃるそうで、その方はそのイメージをですね、ちょっと何らかの方法で、イメージをもとに音楽に変換するということをやっているということを例として紹介されました。
Since my name was mentioned, I'd like to make a brief announcement about tomorrow's performance. Tomorrow I'm going to give experimental performance with theremin, and I'm going to use visual image and the sound from the Seshu Garden, which was it's actually the video work by the artist from Scotland, Andrew Snedden, and I'm going to use his work and modify the sound by theremin. And it's going to be the first presentation in the afternoon tomorrow, so if you have the time, please come back. Thank you. 私の名前が出てきましたので、ついでに明日のパフォーマンスについて、アナウンスさせていただきました。今出てきたようないろんなことが関係しているんですが、テルミンというそのシンセサイザーの前身にあたる楽器を使って、演奏するんですが、実験的なものなんですけど、接収体の映像と音を使って、演奏します。でその映像は、スコットランドのアーティストであるアンドリュース・ネッドさんが、去年接収体で作成したビデオ作品というのです。
他に質 問ある方いらっしゃいますでしょうか。Anybody who has a question? それでは、ノーマン翔さんどうもありがとうございました。Thank you very much for your presentation.